So, welcome back to the post-tea session, and it's very gratifying to see that the hall is full. I'm sure it has something to do with the two speakers that we have today, and we all are waiting. The tough job for me is to introduce a philosopher. All right, and that too, a philosopher of science and a historian to boot. How does one do it? I I'm really nervous that I may make some historical and maybe philosophical blunder in introducing Dhruv Rana. Many of you, I know that he was for 20 years in the Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies in JNU, and he has, I mean, he's called a philosopher and historian of science. What does that mean? Many of his writings, only few I have gone through, but I have, basically talk about the evolution of science as a discipline, as a field of study in India, post independence and also pre independence. And some of his very innovative and fascinating work has been, for example, one on IIT Mumbai, was it? Yes, in which he discusses how, in the post Second World War, post independence era, basically, the interface between the then, prevailing Cold War situation and the decolonization that was taking place, how does that influence the project which was IIT Mumbai? Similarly, many of his other writings also try to understand the development of history of science in Europe, in Asia, in what ways they were interlinked, in what ways in the last 3 4 days, at least 2 3 times, there was a mention of Edward Said's Orientalism, and how this Oriental discourse was created by Europe, by Occident, in order to first and foremost to define itself, but also it was not so innocuous. There was a purpose to dominate, to exploit, uh, to show the Orient as the superior of the inferior Orient, as the inferior of superior Occident. So such projects were there. In writings of Dhruv Rana, you can find many of these ideas in different ways. The topic, he will tell himself, initially it was something to do with epistemology. I can still understand something called ontology. Epistemology is for philosophers. So we have Dhruv Rana.
Yeah, I thank Sanjay Pandey for inviting me to this Gyan workshop. Although, even without being called into the company of a audience, into an audience of international relations, I suffer from an imposter syndrome. But that apart, it has been difficult for me to turn down his invitation, especially when he said, and I will also want you to speak with your friend Varun Sani. And I said, ye to marwayega. So it has been difficult for me to say no. Uh, Please forgive the change in the title of my talk, because the talk I had originally given, the original title was about something in the philosophy of science and how philosophers of science look at questions of epistemic justice and cognitive justice, and how they are playing themselves out in debates on post-coloniality and decoloniality in Brazil, India, China, and other parts of the world. And in fact, it's a paper which is being published shortly, but a version of which will be presented in Berlin in 10 days' time on BRICS and decoloniality. So, yeah. But after listening to Professor Nicolin's talk the other day, I said, no, I shouldn't be that philosophical. Maybe I should be a little more historical. But I am historical in a philosophical kind of way. All right, now, yeah, so to begin with, one of the most inspiring and daunting tasks I have faced as a teacher in GNU for 22 odd years is to come into a hall and to get this look from students, please say something meaningful to us. All right, I mean, it's really a daunting task, and I simultaneously find it both inspiring and frightening. All right, I mean, frightening for the reason that within this hall, I bet there are about 15 or 20 different considerations of what it means to be meaningful. All right, and can one be meaningful to everybody? I mean, that is a task one has a challenge one has to face. Now, Sanjay raised the problem, yeah, what is Dhruv? Is he a philosopher of science or a historian of science? And my self-definition is history and philosophy of science. I mean, in departments of the world, history of science is taught separately, the philosophy of science is taught separately. But there is a tradition which comes down from Gaston Bachelard, Canguilhem, Foucault is part of that tradition in France, and Karl Popper, Lakatos, Feyerabend, in which history and philosophy of science is seen as a unitary interdisciplinary field. You cannot do history of science, as Lakatos says, without doing philosophy of science, and you cannot do philosophy of science without doing history of science. I belong to that tradition. So that should... my password? Yeah, so that I hope will answer Sanjay's dilemma. Now, as a historian and philosopher of science, I mean, I have never seen this interdisciplinary field to be preoccupied with the populist question as to who did what first. That's never an issue I have ever bothered to address in any of my work. That for me is not history and philosophy of science. All right. On the contrary, the primary focus, and this also comes back to Sanjay's question, the primary focus is of the field relate to studying the processes that ensure the production of knowledge that has undergone processes of validation and is certified as robust. But once this knowledge is considered as robust, the historian of science will tell you, but it's not robust forever. When you look back at the history of science, you have a graveyard of theories behind you. All right? So although this knowledge is a subject to processes of validation, as the frontiers of knowledge evolve, this knowledge also evolves and changes. All right? So part of the challenge then resides in acquiring an understanding of how natural order, which is the order being studied by sciences, and the social order, the order studied by social sciences, how both of them are co-produced. It's not that AI is produced first and then society changes, or society changes and requires AI and then AI is produced. No, natural order and social order at a theoretical level are something that are co-produced, all right, and they co-evolve. That is, Sanjay says he knows only ontology, he doesn't know epistemology. Very, very simply put, he's of course being frivolous. Very simply, epistemology, I don't have to tell an audience in GNU what epistemology is, but it's about ways of knowing. All right, so how are ways of knowing and institutional forms and practices, how are they related and how do they co-evolve? That's the question we are concerned with. So, as a historian and philosopher of science, I tell stories about science, but I'm also concerned about how we tell stories about science, how the stories we tell about science change over a period of time. Now, the day before yesterday, Sanjay, briefly alluded to some of the achievements of Soviet science. All right. Now, do not wish to inventory the great achievements of Mendeleev, or people whom I studied as a physicist, Sergei and Pietro Kapitsa, Landau and Lifshitz. All right, and those whom I didn't study but whom I know of, and one of these one was a great evolutionary, considered one of the greatest evolutionary biologists of the first half of the 20th century, Vavilov. All right, and somebody whom I'm going to talk about a little more, the physicist and philosopher of physics, Boris Hessen. All right, now, if you were a student in JNU in 1979, I don't know if the science policy department was still then because it was closed and then reopened. If you were to study Soviet science, this was the book you would have read. They were written by two brothers, Professor Nikulin will, of course, certify, Roy Medvedev and Zhores Medvedev. This is what you would have read on the greatness of Soviet science, and a very critical and important view. But if you came to 2009, that's the book you would have read. A great book by Alexei Kovzhevnikov, a historian and philosopher of science at the University of British Columbia, who probably left Russia after Perestroika. And I mean, what I find surprising about the book is published. The book is published by Imperial College London Press, and there are no scare quotations around the term Stalin. I find that in a way rather interesting. But I mean, what I will do is, in my talk, I will signal a lot of works which I think are important to the field and which mark landmarks in the development of the field. So if you were studying Soviet science in 2009, in 1979, you would have read Roy and Zhores Medvedev. Today, you'll probably read, all right, after the Soviet archive opened after Perestroika, you would probably read Alexei Kovzhevnikov. Now, there's something here to be seen, and which is why I gesture to the book by Kovzhevnikov. The last two people I spoke of, Vavilov and Boris Hessen, died in Stalin's purges in 1937. They were both killed, all right? Now, the thing was, Boris Hessen was part of a delegation headed by the great Soviet thinker Nikolai Bukharin to attend a conference of the history of science in 1931 in Cambridge. All right. Of the 7 members who attended that conference, 4 or 5 were killed in Stalin's purges in 1936 years later. Hessen and Vavilov and Bukharin were 3 of them, and I don't know the other 2. All right. But Boris Hessen presented a paper there called The Socio-Economic Roots of Newton's Principia. It was a classic paper. Till 10 years ago, a copy of the book was still in JNU library. It's called Science at the Crossroads, edited by Krauther, where all the papers published by the Soviet delegation were printed. All right, and Boris Hessen's paper is in that volume. Okay. Now the thing about the paper was, you will say, how can the theory of gravitation have socio-economic roots? So lots of people at the time dismissed, some of the historians of science dismissed the paper, and I say within quotation marks, as a classical Marxist job. Meaning that the underlying, even Marx said that if this is economic determinism, then I'm not a Marxist. But basically that the underlying roots were economic determinist, that the base determines the superstructure. So the paper was dismissed by many as a classical Marxist job, but not by everybody. In 1981, the American journal ISIS published a special issue on that paper and on that meeting, in a way recognizing that this was an important landmark in the field. Okay, and then in 2009, 2 philosophers of science, Gideon Freudenthal from the University of Jerusalem and Peter McLaughlin from the Department of Philosophy, Heidelberg University, published this book called The Social and Economic Roots of the Scientific Revolution. The work of, basically discussing the work of Hessen and Grossman. And in this work, and I'm not going to go through all the arguments, I mean, those who, I mean, I'm ready to discuss it with students who are interested in it at some other point. But they basically said this was no classical Marxist job. That what was really presented here was a very sophisticated historiography for the study of the sciences, and not only that, that it was offering an alternate program for the history of science. All right. So, yeah. So, so much for the Soviet part of my discussion. Now, that apart, the role of the Soviet Union in the development of science, as Sanjay was referring to, in post-colonial India and the circulation of scientific knowledge has been of great importance. And again, I turn back to history. The period beginning in the 1890s marks the inauguration of an important movement and transformative process referred to as the internationalization of science. And I've referred to the components here. I mean, these are definitions taken from the scholar Eugene Rabinovich. All right. So, and yeah, whose premise was that while science might contribute to the prosperity and the prestige of a nation, science itself was an international enterprise that required the free and unfettered circulation of ideas and scientists across national boundaries. All right. I mean, even, the Pope of French science, Pasteur, whom you've all heard of, he said that, yeah, it's important, I mean, you made a scientific discovery, prestige of a nation goes up. But please remember that without the internationalism of science, science cannot prosper. All right. And those of you, I know you were not even born then. When Reagan was in power, he tried to close down scientific communication for some time. And the entire scientific community says, stop these Koreans and Indians and Chinese from coming and studying in India. They take our ideas and go back and develop their own sciences and technology. And the American scientific community said, you don't know the benefits we get from their being here. All right. So I think the debate continues today, right? In some form. All right. But, yeah, all right. So now here, this is a picture from an important meeting in 1927 called the Solvay Conference. And here's the meeting of the world's leading theoretical physicists at the time. And if you look at this picture, well, it's except for Marie Curie sitting there, it's more or less all white men. And you look at the next Solvay Conference, and over there, you find some Japanese faces, some Chinese faces, and 3 brown faces from India. Within 5 years, somehow, the chromatography of science has changed. Okay. Now, so the movement referred from, benefited from the rise of a larger political movement referred to as internationalism, advocating greater political or economic cooperation among states, nations, and requiring and transcending national, political, racial, and cultural boundaries. But the internationalism of science, like political internationalism, and I hope I'm not, boring students of international relations with these details, received a major setback with the outbreak of the First World War. Following which, there was a short period when the scientific community boycotted German science and scientists. Contrary to the objections of a great scientist from Sweden called Svante Arrhenius, a Nobel Prize-winning chemist, but today we also know that he was amongst the first to talk about global warming and set the conditions for the emergence of climate science. Now over here, there's an Indian part of the story. I don't have to tell anybody here who J.C. Bose was. And J.C. Bose was traveling to Europe at the time. He was traveling from colonial India. And he sort of was participating in this boycott of German science and scientists. And Svante Arrhenius goes to him and said, don't get into this game at all. There are lots of German scientists to whom you need to talk and speak and discuss your physics with, and you should go to Germany. And J.C. Bose did, and he benefited from that. And well, I mean, there's a paper I wrote much later on Weimar physics and India in a book called Disciplines and Movements, and there's much discussion about that relationship. But the troubles for Scientific International would continue through the 1930s with the rise of fascism. All right, but the internationalist perspective ethos prevailed when scientists began to organize themselves into what were called popular fronts of scientists, who went on to constitute a committee which in French is called Comité International contre le Fascisme, or the International Committee Against Fascism. And it was at this time that the German physicist Max Born, whom some of you might know but will know better now, who was the PhD supervisor of Robert Oppenheimer. And so it's at this time that Max Born is invited by C.V. Raman to the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. And he spends some time there. And C.V. Raman, of course, also wants to invite somebody else, a revolutionary figure from the history of quantum theory, Erwin Schrödinger, to come to Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. But by the time Erwin Schrödinger has already got a job at the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies, and that's where he goes. Now, what are these stories about? I'm basically trying to set a backdrop to internationalism of the sciences. After the war, the Popular Front organizations were more or less dissolved. But the ideology remained in a way. And they constituted themselves into the Scientific Workers' Associations. And these Scientific Workers' Associations were to become the conscience of science. They were to become the ethical conscience of science. But by the 1980s, at least in India, a lot of them had degenerated into what I call, protesting for data issues, meaning increase in DA, increase in TA. But the origins of the movement were indeed politically very important. All right. Now, some of these scientists, here are two very important scientists, particularly two renowned British ones, Sir Julian Huxley, and of course this man who's on the right, on the left, whose work has preoccupied me for decades, Joseph Needham, and several others played a very active role in introducing the S into UNESCO. All right. So basically, UNESCO was a post-League of Nations organization, and it was established as UNESCO after the end of the Second World War, UNESCO. It was known as UNESCO. And these two people played a role in saying, no, science has to be there. All right? So they finally bring the S into UNESCO, and UNESCO becomes UNESCO. A group of scientists, historians, and philosophers of science from all parts of the world and social sciences joined to draft UNESCO's constitution and motto. What was UNESCO to do? And as students of international relations, you all know the famous quotation that wars begin in the minds of men, and it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. And so, in other words, what they were setting out for UNESCO was a new cultural, historical charter. All right? And, these two books, the Humanity in the Making, edited by the French philosopher Roger Paul Drouin, and 60 Years of UNESCO by the historian and philosopher of science Patrick Petitjean, were books which tell you the history of it. But what really came out in the 1950s was this huge 7-volume project. It started in the 1950s and it ended in 2009. All right. Professor S. Gopal was one of the many editors. But he was dying, and then my colleague Esir Farnaby and I were asked to edit the South and Southeast Asia section of this volume. So now over here, there's something to be said, and this is pointed out by Patrick Petija in his work. He argues that it's a sorry story of UNESCO in a way, that in the 1950s, UNESCO's policy instruments and programs were developed by intellectuals, people who were associated with all these movements. All right? And two major projects emerged out of these deliberations on what you might call scientific humanism, which does not preclude the social sciences. The first of these was this project, The History of Humanity. All right? And the project was formulated by historians of nothing less than the Annales School, Lucien Febvre. All right? And amongst others, the person who wrote the document against racism was Claude Lévi-Strauss. None other than Claude Lévi-Strauss. All right? So, and it is over here you begin to see that the early projects of UNESCO begin to develop. The second was a policy instrument framed for the science division of UNESCO by Joseph Needham. And this is referred to as the peripheral principle. All right? The peripheral principle basically arose from the understanding that the primary triggers for war between nations and groups of nations was inequality. The peripheral principle became a cardinal instrument for the science division of UNESCO that oriented its interventions for the developing world. The principle stated that UNESCO would not undertake any projects or interventions in the so-called bright zone, but would focus on stressing the inequalities, on redressing the inequalities between the different worlds of science, namely the developing and the developed worlds. There was one exception, and this is a nice story to tell. All right. So a proposal came up from the Pakistani physicist Abdus Salam that the third world needs an international center of theoretical physics. And Salam felt that the best place to locate the International Center for Theoretical Physics was Bombay. Bombay because TIFR was there, and there would be a symbiotic relationship between TIFR and the International Center of Theoretical Physics. Why did the International Center of Theoretical Physics land up at Trieste in Italy? And that had to do with one little reason. Look at the two supporters of the institute. There is UNESCO there, but under that is the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And India was not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the IAEA said that, well, we cannot support the International Center for Theoretical Physics in India. And so, well, the Italians had the land in this thing, but so it went to Trieste in Italy. But it remained a place where theoretical physicists from the third world could meet and interact with Nobel laureates and important theoretical physicists for the third world, and it continues to be that way. And I don't think now the third world focus is so much because, the institute seems to have fulfilled, its role. All right. Now, the end of the Second World War was a period marked by a shift in the nature of collaboration. During the period before the end of the Second World War, collaboration was what was autotelic. A group of scientists came together, S.N. Bose sends a paper to Einstein, they publish a paper together. Einstein feels S.N. Bose should be invited to Germany. Right? So, a collaboration arose from relationships between people. They were driven internally by the demands of the community of scientists. But during the war years, a new kind of science emerged, which is called big science. Big science meant big military, big manpower, big machines, big media, big money. And within the world, I don't know, you've all seen the film Oppenheimer. The most poignant moment in the film is Oppenheimer's telling the guys, what you're doing that thing about the bomb, but basically, we should be telling you, no, we'll take it from here now. You're not needed anymore. It's the most poignant moment in the film. All right? And so what happens is now, after the Second World War, the nature of international becomes heterotelic. It's driven by governments through bilateral relationships between nation states. Science becomes politics by other means. Okay? Now, now it is in this context that we have to understand, and here Sanjay is referring to a paper I wrote on the IITs, and I must confess, that it is one paper I've written which is taught in some universities in departments of international studies. All right, maybe Sanjay knows that. Now, let me get into the context of the founding of the IITs and the role of the Soviet Union in that. Now, the Sarkar Committee was constituted before India became independent in 1945, and it was mandated to visualize not engineering education, but technological education after the passing of colonialism. So I'd like to make a distinction between engineering education and technological education, and I'll make this clear very soon. Now, one of the recommendations of the committee was the foundation of a technological institute on the model of MIT. Now, instruction in the engineering sciences, a new field of engineering had emerged, which was called engineering sciences, and the engineering sciences were basically engineering linked up with research in the pure sciences. And the engineering sciences had emerged in the United States. It was an American invention. All right? It is different from technical education. It is different from engineering education. All right? And gradually, this model was traveled to other parts of the world. It transformed technological education in Europe, in Germany, in Russia, and many places. I will come back to this a little later. By the 1940s, as Ron Bassett mentions in this book, The Technological Indian, a large number of Indians did study in MIT, and some of them came back to India with their ideas about what MIT was about and what technological education was about, and how technological education was an advance over engineering education. It also became part of the anti-colonial consciousness that we have to go beyond engineering. All right. Now, over here we need a little sort of background. The political scientists here will forgive me. But however, as Emanuel Wallerstein pointed out, and we saw this in Varun's intervention and Professor Nicolin's intervention before, as Wallerstein points out, the end of the Second World War marked the transition from Pax Britannica to Pax Americana. All right? And this is reflected in the ascent of not just American soft power, but more importantly for the things I study, the rise of the American university. All right? So the domain of higher education, and this is a very, very important book. I love its title also. All right? Now, the domain of higher education in the United States now witnessed a two-way process. It was not just influence traveling from the United States to the rest of the world, but it was also influence traveling from the rest of the world to the United States. So what the world witnessed was an Americanization of higher education. What the Americas witnessed was an internationalization of American education. Okay, so after 1947, following up on the recommendation of the Sarkar Commission, IIT Kharagpur, this is the paper Varun was referring to for any of you who want to see it, where this is discussed in detail, so I'll just summarize the argument. Following up on the recommendations of the Sarkar Commission, IIT Kharagpur was established. But within a few years, just a few years after the establishment of IIT Kharagpur, there arose the realization that this was not what the committee had envisaged. This was not an MIT type institution. So the government of India approached the United States for help to set up an MIT type of institution in India. And a team from the USA was sent to make an assessment. The team reported back that India was not yet ready to have an MIT type institution. Fortunately for India, a UNESCO meeting was organized at Uruguay in 1953. And in those days, well, the Indian educationists were highly educated men, and led by Humayun Kabir and others. And they made an incredible presentation at Uruguay, which merited a mention in the New York Times. In which, of course, the Indian delegation said that, you know what, we are now in a decolonizing world. We need your help, otherwise we will return to the kind of conflicts we have lived through. At this meeting, the Soviet delegation spoke up. The Soviet delegation said, there are some unspent rubles of ours lying with UNESCO, and you could use those rubles and our technological capabilities to help build such an institute of technology. So the suggestion crystallized in the formation of IIT Bombay with Russian technological assistance. Now, of course, the Indians didn't tell the Russians that we really want an MIT type institution. All right. So while they helped set up the IIT Bombay, it was on the model of an MIT. Okay. Now, maybe the Soviets were also aware of it. I'm quite sure they were. Within a couple of years of the establishment of Mumbai, the USA, the United States, sent a delegation to assess the climate in India. And this time around, it said, no, the climate is right to set up an MIT type institution in India. And so IIT Kanpur comes up, and the Americans play a very active role in building one of the first computer science centers at IIT Kanpur. Yeah, all right. So the dynamics of the Cold War is clearly visible here. But this was also the decade of the Bandung Conference. And India's commitment to non-alignment was evident in its not putting all its eggs in one basket. So it was not going to say, all right, we want to build a couple of more IITs, so let the Americans and the Russians divide it amongst themselves. They shopped around elsewhere. And so the Federal Republic of Germany was called in to set up the IIT at Madras. IIT Delhi was built with the help of the United Kingdom. But of all these four countries, the United Kingdom invested the least in the founding of the IITs. And my own feeling is that perhaps also by this time, the Indians had acquired the know-how of how to build, how to develop such IITs. Maybe so they needed less of English help, of help from the United Kingdom at this time. How am I doing for time?
5 minutes.
I'll take 10, huh? Right? Okay. But as far as science and technology are concerned, UNESCO played a role in maintaining the lines of communication between both sides of the Iron Curtain. This was indeed beneficial for India. However, within the realm of strategic technologies such as the space program, its non-aligned stance enabled a productive collaboration and benefit from both sides of the Cold War divide. We could draw upon the Americans, we could draw upon the Russians. There were nevertheless strategic areas where India was not a signatory, since India was not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, wherein India had to rely on its homegrown competences to develop its technological systems, especially in nuclear, the cryogenic fuels, and a number of other things. Now this will take a little time. Now I come to the second part of the story, and then after that I'll stop. Now, this was really to be the subject of my talk. All right. And it relates to how the social imaginary of science has changed over the last half century and the philosophical issues it raises for the sciences of the global south. Uh, One of the outcomes of the scientific humanism of the 1950s and the 1960s that was that it was concurrent with the processes of political decolonization. And another process which few people speak about, the massification of the university. And one of the outcomes of this was the re-examination of the question of the origins of modern science, or even the non-emergence of modern science in different parts of the world. That's the question Merton asked. Why did modern science arise in the West? Which is the question which Weber asked. Why did capitalism arise in the West? And now people began to ask, so why didn't modern science arise in China? Or why didn't it arise in India? All right. Needham himself had commenced his project of a lifetime on the science and civilization in China that appeared in 7 huge volumes. All right. Works like these led to the convergence of several genealogies of thinking about science in other cultures and civilizations. The feminist philosopher of science, Sandra Harding, in her book Is Science Multicultural, says that what the 1980s saw were 3 historiographic revolutions. The emergence of post-colonial science studies, the feminist philosophy of science, I'm sorry with the glitch there, and, oh God, it's a double glitch, post-colonial theory and history of science, all right? So these are the 3 historiographic revolutions of the late 1970s and 1980s. These developments informed the researches of a number of historians and philosophers of science in India. From China, from France, from Brazil, from Egypt. At a meeting held in New Delhi in early 1985 at the erstwhile National Institute of Science, Technology and Development Studies, a group of Indian and French scholars decided to set up what was called the Science and Empires Network. And the French team went on to take the initiative to stabilize and get the network going under a multilateral program. The network initiated historical studies on the politics of knowledge, the connectedness of cultures of knowledge, and in the processes challenged the narrative of the purely endogenous origins of modern science. Modern science was not purely a Western invention. All right? And this was a trend that Needham had already initiated with his river metaphor and his picture of what is called ecumenical science. All right, I mean, in the discussion, if somebody else asks me, I'll explain that. Now, clearly, there was a recognition of the different histories of each of the regions concerned. India had been a colony by conquest. A number of Latin American countries who were participants, Brazil particularly, Heloisa Dominguez, Silvia Figueiro, and others, talked about how, well, I mean, in Latin America, you had what were called settler colonies. All right? And in the history of science, the underlying meta-narrative of the histories was that of non-emergence, or it was a narrative of a lagging behind. All right? The same was true of Russia in the 19th century. All right? Accounts were seen as, Russia was seen as belonging to the European periphery. I once was asked to give a keynote address at an association called Steps in Europe. Science and technology at the European periphery. What was the European periphery? The European periphery was everything excluding Italy, Holland, Germany, France and England. Everything else was the European periphery. Now obviously, ideas like this had to be challenged. All right, so the Russian mathematician, for example, Nikolai Lobachevsky, independently discovered what is called non-Euclidean geometry at the foundations of Einstein's work, but that is known as Riemannian geometry, named eponymously after the German mathematician by that name. So Paul Lobachevsky, sitting at Kazan University, not linked with the universities where the most rapid institutionalization of science was taking place. China and Japan had never been colonies. And we had a number of scholars from China and Japan who were part of this network. Okay, like Russia. And because of their political sovereignty, they ensured more favorable terms of technology transfer and their pace of modernization of the sciences. Gradually, several scholars commenced work on Francophone Africa, Senegal, Ivory Coast, and the Maghreb. In short, many of the cognitive, meta-historical, and philosophical concerns prefigured and were shared by nations belonging now to the trade and economic coalition referred to as BRICS, as well as several wishing to join it. Egypt, for example. So, within debates on the epistemologies of the South, Boaventura Santos and Shiv Vishwanathan have been two important interlocutors for epistemic and cognitive justice. And that was what I thought I was qualified to speak of today. But I think I'll stop here. But I didn't wish to bore you with philosophical argumentation. But this is the larger paper I've written, which will be available on the internet in 1 month's time. And you can have a look at it. All right. Thank you very much.
So I'm very sure Dhruv's presentation must have generated some queries, and but I would suggest that we take up the next presentation. All right. So, any queries on this presentation? I understand that some of the ideas and things that Dhruv said are the students of IR are not very familiar with, but this decolonization of science and how in the post-independence era in India and elsewhere in so-called third world or global south, the discipline of science emerged and tried to free itself. These are some of the questions you may like to ask. Yes.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
It was indeed a very nice presentation. So you were talked about the transformation of science from the age of autotelic mode to the heterotelic mode. But sir, do you really think so that even in the contemporary time, that transformation has indeed happened in the actual sense? Because what I'm able to see even in the nowadays, that the scientific development is also very much concentrated in the practical sense. Theoretically, we talks about the development of the science all over the world, but still if you look at, so I believe it has not been really deconstructed and decolonized. Because even in now there are many issues of the patent and the issues in the setting of the technologies. So I'm not able to actually observe the actual transformation of science from the autotelic mode to the heterotelic mode. So please give your perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Okay. So there are two things here. First is that when we say that the transformation of science takes place from the autotelic to the heterotelic, it's not that the autotelic totally dies out. The autotelic does not die out, all right? But what happens is that the heterotelic becomes more important. For example, if you look at the LIGO project, the project for the detection of gravitational waves, I mean, there are, I don't know how many 100 countries involved, The funding is coming from 100 countries. There are a large number of scientists involved. I mean, this obviously has to be a multilateral relationship between governments, all right? But I think what's really bothering you is another question. And the question that is bothering you is that heterotelic collaboration did not in some way demolished the center-periphery structure of science? That's the question you're asking, right? That even today there are centers and even today there are peripheries. And I totally agree with you. Now, over there, you can tell there are two stories you have to contend with. In the old center-periphery framework, theory was made in the West and data was collected at the periphery. And the work of historians of science has shown that that is not the case at all. All right. So in the auditing of the history of science, center periphery doesn't work. But center periphery works in another way. All right. And I mean, the work of Amit Prasad, for example, shows us that, well, Indians working on MRI, experimentalists, they do their work in India. Nobody takes the experimental work seriously. They go and do the same experiment in the United States and you publish it from there, and the work is taken more seriously. So there's an asymmetric distribution of credit between the center and the periphery. That has not totally disappeared. I agree with you. So, I mean, as long as we learn to separate these two, I mean, we have some analytical handle on this thinking. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Good evening. In the context of decolonization of science, if you look at the West or per se global North or global South, whether we like or not, this is the fact that West has contributed in science, which has transformed the world throughout the ages. For example, if you take the example of Newton, there was a huge transformation. After Newton, there was Einstein, huge transformation. After Einstein, there is Stephen Hawking's of theoretical physics, quantum physics. There was huge transformation. So my proposition is, what do you think if West make a patent that what we have discovered so far, we are going to make a patent? In this case, what do you think? Global South will be a blind or lame without the acceptance or the science which has been contributed from the West. What is your take? Thank you.
Yeah, you know what? One is we have to learn. One is we have to learn to think out of the great man picture of science. All right, and that is something which the history of science has managed to do over the last 30 to 40 years. That one, science is social and collective activity. All right. So what is the patenting system and the great man picture of the history of science are both linked up with each other. So if you ask me personally, I would say throughout the patenting system, science belongs to the common goods. That's if you ask me personally. But what does decolonizing the sciences mean? And I think one must recognize, and this is something I am still writing about in developing my ideas, there are 4 different moments of decolonization of the sciences. Decolonization did not begin today. It did not begin 10 years ago. The history of decolonization goes back to the end of the 19th century in India. It goes back to Satish Chandra Mukherjee, Binoy Kumar Sarkar, to a whole range of people who said, we don't want this university as an examining body. We want a university of teaching and research. What the colonizer gave you was a university as an examining body. It took you 30 years of struggle before you could build a university of teaching and research. In 1904, the University Charter Act is passed, which permits postgraduate teaching and research. Is that not an act of decolonization? All right. So what do we mean by decolonization? All right. So I think there have been different moments. One. Number 2, how do you look at how modern science has contributed? I'm a student of physics. I grew up with, all those landmarks you mentioned in the history of physics. All right. But today we've come to know, for example, that, if you look at the voyages of discovery, that's where the history of modern science begins. Columbus's discovery of America. I mean, rather than go into it, we suddenly feel that in these interactions, just like when we talked of American hegemony, we talked of two-way flows. In a Europeans' encounter with non-Western people, there were two-way flows which reshaped the identity and reconstituted the identity of modern science. This is something we have to recognize, which is why Needham says there is something called modern science, but there's no thing called Western science. And I think if we speak about decolonizing science, by speaking the language of Western science, Chinese science, Islamic science, Hindu science, we are recolonizing ourselves. Modern science arises, Needham writes, modern science, it is true, arises in the West, but it arises at a conjuncture of knowledge flows from several civilizations. So the West has no claim to calling modern science Western. We have to recognize that. All right. So what I argue in my paper is we need a history of connectedness and a history of different ways of knowing.
In fact, Bruce worked with Irfan Habib on Needham, takes up some of these issues.
Yeah.
All right. But the fundamental issue of knowledge and power,
Yes.
that problematic,
No, that problematic
and
remains.
this is something that he was hinting at.
No. So, no, I mean, I told you, people are concerned about the patenting system. I've been part of the people science movements which have been challenging the patenting system. The patenting system is based, just look at the struggle for open software. Everything is developed in the university, and then, all the software is developed in the university, and then some Bill Gates, or I don't know, somebody comes along and then lays a claim on a patent for it. The interlinkages between private research labs and university research labs, which are publicly funded, are so foundational, and yet we would like to patent that knowledge. I find that ethically problematic.
Yes, but this would be the last one. I understand. All right, 2 questions there and no more.
Good evening, Professor. It has been a very enriching lecture, and there was a lot of food for thought. So, I was actually going to ask the question of patents, which you already answered somewhat.
Yeah, but one more thing. I am not an expert on patents, so please take everything I say with a huge amount of salt on patents. Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, you told us, like in your slides in your lecture, you said science is politics by, like when you were talking about this I forgot the word, that autotelic and heterotelic.
Yeah.
You use the word science is politics by other means, but science, at least what we see when during the Nazis' time and other, eugenics was used by Nazi Germany for the execution of Jews and other people there, as well as it has been, although eugenics as a field has been very problematic in general, but science has been used by a lot of illiberal elements. I don't like to use the word illiberal per se because of the connotation it has, but it has been.
Please use it. It's okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
By illiberal elements in politics or for the sake of politics, or in the current context, we can see science is used in a lot of terrorist or anti-state activities in general. So, how can we, in the system, in the current system, in the liberal internationalism, as you already mentioned, how can we how to decide what science, which field to protect?
Something called good science and bad
Bad science.
Yeah, okay. The sociologist of science, Helga Watney, posed the question, can bad men do good science? And yes, your example of eugenics tells you that. Now, I also said at the beginning of my talk that not only do I seek to describe science, but I like to investigate the stories we tell about science. Now, up to the 1950s or the 1960s, there was an assumption that science was something neutral. All right? If you were a good person, you would use science for good ends. and if you were a bad person, you would use science for bad ends. All right? But despite that, Mertonian sociology of science has told us that, science has certain social values. Communitarianism, universalism, disinterestedness, but science is a social institution. All right? So corresponding to these social norms of science are certain epistemic norms. Right? What we seem to think today, and this is something I've argued also in a paper in a volume edited by Romla Thapar on the role of the public intellectual in India. My own feeling is that for the last 50 years, science has been cohabiting with the military-industrial complex. All right, and so if you look at what has happened to science today, you read the work of John Simon, a wonderful book called Real Science. All right, we are in a world of post-academic science, and in this world of post-academic science, the norms of communitarianism, universalism, disinterestedness, etc., it looks like these norms have changed. And the new norms are that science is proprietary, science is local, all right, science is commission, science is expert knowledge. So what you're saying is that too has happened. Has post-academic science replaced academic science? No. The fact that you can ask this question tells me that. All right? But yes, there is currently a struggle going on between these two ideas of science. All right? And well, neoliberal policy is supporting post-academic science. All right?
I know that this was not enough, but we have constraints of time, and we also have another very interesting presentation by someone who has his own claim to fame. In the last 30 years, I have been associated with JNU for almost 35, 37 years. And in the last 30 years, if you take a survey of the best and most popular teachers in every sense of the term, classroom teaching, as well as their friendly demeanor and their ability and will to help the students, I'm very sure Professor Varun Sahani would figure among the top 5. So Professor Varun Sahani, again, and for most of you who are students of SIS, he doesn't need an introduction. He has been with the Center for International Politics, CPOD, what we call. And for some time, he has been not with us, missing in action. And when he came back, many thought and many said that finally the prodigal has returned. But I'm afraid it's not very true. He will keep coming to us, but this may be some of his last lectures. I don't know. I should not be saying this perhaps, but of course he has been with us. He will remain with us. Today he is going to touch upon a topic which again is something which he has done many times. His research interests, of course, he has a degree from Oxford. He lived there for 5-6 years. He has been a regular speaker. I mean, one of the most prolific and speakers. You name any institution which has to do with defense or strategic studies or international relations, anywhere in India and outside, and Professor Varun Sahni has been speaking there. He also has, so for example, National Defense College, 14 years straight, he spoke every year at their annual convention, or what you call it. He has been associated with many other such institutions, but his main areas of interest include nuclear deterrence issues, regional security, emerging balance in Asia Pacific. In fact, not just these, lest someone believes that it has only something to do with security and strategic aspects. No. Today morning, we had one seminar which he was presiding on diaspora. Professor Amit Chauvin Ray was speaking. And of course, Professor Amit Ray spoke more about the role of diaspora in investment, in expansion of trade and economic relations. But after that, in his 10 minutes presidential speech, Professor Varun Sahni touched upon issues which were, his sheer depth of his understanding of issues, something like diaspora, which is somewhere, of course, there among his various expert domains, but certainly not the core domain. But he could still make sense. The way his command over ideas and language is something which I always marvel at, and the way he can weave ideas with the correct language and diction, that only Varun Sahni can do. Maybe the dean can be a competitor, but I'm not sure. Professor Varun Sahni.
See if we can move this up here.
Yes, we can. Excellent. Very slowly, but yes, it's possible.
Some. Good evening. Clearly, the farewells for me have already begun.
I shouldn't have said.
We will best remember not to give Professor Pandey an opportunity during whatever farewell is organized for me, because he's already given me my farewell. But thank you so much to both of you, Professor Pandey, Dr. Sutar, for inviting me to this. I'm deeply touched, and I should also state for the record that it's for the first time in 3 decades in the service of this university that I've been a guest of either the Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies or indeed the Center for Political Studies. So it's really nice. Today in the morning was the first time in 30 years I spoke at CITD, and it's interesting. It's just towards the end, I'm very fortunate I'm receiving these wonderful invitations from all of you. So I've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm not going to waste too much time in these preliminaries, but I will start off with some preliminary concepts. And after these preliminary concepts, I'm going to lay before you 2 diametrically opposed origin stories. Then I'm going to talk about varying interests, motives, and approaches. I'm going to talk a bit about what I consider a surprisingly persistent trajectory. And finally, I'm going to talk about an incoherent but necessary expansion. And I hope in the process of doing this, we would get at least some idea about how I think about the BRICS and the future of the BRICS. So preliminary concepts first. And I'm going to really be very light here. I'm not going to go heavy on any kind of theory here. But there are really 3 core issues, my friends. For states, for societies, for communities, for families, for individuals, is to survive, to thrive, and to be oneself. Those are the 3 key drivers: to survive, to thrive, and to be oneself. So we are talking here about security.
which is protection from existential threats. We're talking here about prosperity, which is enhancement of well-being. And finally, we're talking here about identity, which is preservation of core values. Ultimately, these are the three drivers, and this happens in a world that is interconnected, interdependent, and interpenetrated. I don't have time to go into what each of these terms mean, but each of these terms have a very specific and mutually exclusive meaning. So when we think then, my friends, about security, prosperity, and identity, we can think of it like this, right? Say that security is the base. If you don't have security, you can't have prosperity. And if you don't have prosperity, you can't really have identity, right? So security comes first. Or we can look at it as sort of in a way mutually reinforcing. The more security you have, the more prosperous you are. The more prosperous you are, the more resolved your identity issues are, which in turn make you more secure. And just as there's a virtuous cycle, there can be a vicious cycle if you turn the arrows the other way. So the less secure you are, the less prosperous you are, the more insecure your identity is, so on and so forth. Or, my friends, you can look at it like this, as overlapping kind of circles, as Venn diagrams, where each of these are imperatives. You need all three of them. And basically, you've got to try to find that sweet spot where you can get all three of them in balance. So not too much of security, not too much of identity, not too much of prosperity, but all of them to a certain measure that is adequate for all of us. Now, I'm not going to tell you how you should think about it, but in conceptual terms, this is a very easy way in which to begin to understand why things happen in the world, and particularly in the world of politics and in the world of interstate relations. That, somewhere out there, there's either an identity claim or a prosperity claim or a security claim, and I'll just leave this at that. The second point I had made on the opening day, you remember when I had been called up here by Professor Pandey to sort of speak for a few minutes, and I'll just sort of basically summed it up in a single slide for you. Why do states cooperate? They cooperate to aggregate power, which is augmenting security by combining capabilities, or to solve problems, which is seeking win-win solutions to achieve better outcomes for mutual benefit and prosperity, or it is to build community, which is transforming identity by building permanent friendships through concerted strategy. So again, if you think about it, in a way, this does map with what we've already been just thinking about: security, prosperity, identity. But there is, so states may choose to work together, in conjunction with each other for a mix of motives, but really there is no fourth motive. It is invariably one of these three motives. And the third point, because this I heard in the opening day, and it's something which keeps featuring where the BRICS are concerned, is to keep talking about them as being a challenge to the West. I think Professor Dhruv Raina already told us, very sagely that, look, there's no such thing as Western science. You have modern science, right? It may have originated in the West for a bunch of socio-historical reasons, but let's not sort of assume, therefore, that it's Western. I would say democracy is exactly the same, by the way. It's dangerous if we begin to think about democracy as being Western. It's not. It arose in certain historical circumstances, but it isn't. It's like science. It's universal. So here the question, my friends, is which West and which non-West? And I'm going to lay out to you how I see it. Please feel free, to disagree with me. When we talk about the West in this West non-West sense, we are not talking about the cultural West, because at least two BRICS countries have deep roots in Western culture. Okay, I mean, Tchaikovsky is Western. You go to the Hermitage, that's Western. Since Peter the Great, but I would say well before Peter the Great, Russia has been Western. Russians like to tell us that their symbol of the two-headed eagle, symbolizes that Russia looks both towards Europe and towards Asia. It is the authentic Eurasian power, right? So you can't sort of, any argument in a cultural sense that Russia is not Western is, to my mind, a completely ridiculous argument. But I would argue so is Brazil. You can't really understand Brazilian culture for all of the indigenous cultures and traditions that exist within Brazil You cannot consider Brazil in that sense to be non-Western either. So culturally it is. And as Mahashweta Devi told us, reminded us, the West is within us. So even those of us who are in areas that we would culturally call the non-West, that doesn't mean that we are immune from the West. Mahashweta Devi tells us the West is within us. So, we are not thinking about the West here culturally. That's one very important point. It's not even the political West. We're not talking here about democracy, non-democracy, that kind of thing, because the sequencing of economic empowerment and political choice is a very divisive issue. What comes first? Do you first, basically empower people economically and then you give them liberty, political liberty, or do you do it at the same time? Do you do political liberty first? That's a pretty divisive issue. I don't think that's an issue which unites the BRICS countries in any case. We can be quite sure about that. Our concern is with the geopolitical West, right? And by that we mean quite specifically a group of countries who have run the world for far too long. So when we sort of posit the BRICS as being in some ways non-Western or anti-Western, we mean it in this very limited sense of the West. And I would urge you to not expand that into anything other than that, because then we are missing the point. We are missing the picture. Let's move on to the second thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is these two diametrically opposed origin stories. Origin stories are very important, right? Human beings tell stories. We are a species that loves to sit around the campfire at night and tell stories to each other. Narrative. The stories we tell is how we make sense of ourselves as individuals, as communities, as nations, as states, right? So when it comes to the BRICS, I lay before you two origin stories, and they are curiously diametrically opposed. The first of them is the one we've all heard of, which is the series of reports by Goldman Sachs from 2001 onwards, which basically argued the indispensable need to reorganize global governance to include the BRICS because of the future size of the BRIC economies. I'm putting S within brackets because when the original Jim O'Neill reports came up, South Africa was not a part of the picture. And the impact of the BRICS on the world economy and globalization. So there were these three reports that Goldman Sachs brought out from 2001 onwards. And, this is the story that has stuck in the narrative. The stories we tell about the BRICS, right? The origin story is entirely about bringing some large countries into global governance structures with the express purpose of strengthening the world capitalist economy. That's the purpose of that narrative. But my friends, I want to suggest to you that there exists an alternate origin story driven by politics rather than economics that aims at challenging Western dominance in world affairs. And the hero of that story is not Jim O'Neill, it is Yevgeny Primakov, who was the foreign minister and then the prime minister of Russia towards the end of the last century. And beginning in 1999, Primakov promoted Russia, India, and China, the RIC, right, as a strategic triangle to counterbalance the United States. So we are enamored by the 2001 story of Jim O'Neill. We forget the 99 story of Primakov. And we all do, unfortunately, right? And then Brazil joins the grouping in September of 2006 when the four foreign ministers met at the margins of the general debate at the UN General Assembly. So the RIC becomes the BRIC when Brazil joins it, right? And this, by the way, this second origin story predates Primakov by 3 generations, because Lenin had observed in 1923 that, and this was a piece he wrote in Pravda in 1923, in which he writes, in the last analysis, the outcome of the struggle will be determined by the fact that Russia, India, China account for the overwhelming majority of the population of the globe. So this is actually, Primakov was articulating quite literally, in the post-Soviet period, he's actually articulating an idea that goes back to the early Bolsheviks. It's a very old idea that somehow if these 3 countries could work together, they could change the world. Brazil is, of course, added on to it. So I would urge that when we think about the BRICS, to remember that there's not but 2 origin stories out here that are competing with each other. And both of them are valid stories. I'm not saying the Jim O'Neill story is invalid. Please don't misunderstand me. But I'm saying that there's another story which is just as important as the Jim O'Neill story. Okay, now I want to spend a fair amount of time talking about the third broad area I wanted to talk about, which is varying interests, motivations, and approaches. My friends, as I see it, the BRICS countries have a common motive of joining the grouping. It gives them the ability that they individually lack to challenge the current structures of global governance. Right? Now that's the kind of the common motive. But each of the 5 BRICS, and I'm going to be talking largely about the original 5. Towards the end, I'll talk about the expansion, but the thrust of my talk is on the original 5. Each of the 5 BRICS countries has also a uniquely specific motive for getting involved in the grouping. And I think we need to understand what those motives are. And you'll see how, at least as the way I view it, how diverse, in fact, the motives are. For Russia, the decision was entirely political, an attempt to break out of the international isolation in which it found itself after the Georgian crisis of August of 2008. And by doing this, in the first BRICS summit at Ekaterinburg, it was a reminder to the US, to the European Union, to NATO, that Russia still held many cards in its hands, so taking Russia for granted would not be a sensible strategy. And the first BRICS summit is, from the Russian point of view, largely about this. Why is China in it? The BRIC grouping provided China with an excellent opportunity to challenge the status quo at a very low cost to itself. You don't have to invest very much to become a part of the BRICS, right? And as a rising power, China has an enormous incentive in challenging the status quo. So anything that challenges the status quo, leaving, of course, the P5 in the UN Security Council, which is the one status quo where China becomes very conservative, it doesn't want to change that. But apart from that, everything else China would like to change, because any change would basically be to China's advantage. So the BRIC grouping allowed China also to circumvent the attempt by India to keep it out of IPSA. I know most of you in this room will not even remember IPSA, but this was an initiative which predates BRICS, which was India, Brazil, and South Africa together, right? And this was something that was being very strongly projected by all 3 countries. IPSA was constantly projected as an initiative involving 3 significant democracies of the global south. And so China, from the very beginning, had an interest in sort of seeing some way this IPSA could be, because IPSA was launched itself as the 3 democracies. It became impossible to include China in that. So by inviting South Africa to join the BRIC during the Sanya summit of 2011, China has in effect made IPSA redundant. Because now, in the future, as I say, it's extremely likely, and that is happening, that IPSA summits will take place on the sidelines of BRIC summits before IPSA itself fades into oblivion, because the 3 countries of IPSA have now all been folded into the BRICS, which earlier was not the case. You had the BRIC, you didn't have South Africa. So there was a logic for the India, Brazil, and South Africa, their leaderships to meet separately. Now there's no need. If you're going to be meeting every year in the BRICS, you hold another small meeting in another room on IPSA on the side to keep that thing going. But basically, you're out of it, okay? What about Brazil, my friends? Now, Brazilian perception of the role of BRICS seems to be anchored in its prior understanding of IPSA, which I just talked about, and Mercosur. Mercosur is what? The common market of the South, which is the market that essentially binds together 4 countries in the southern cone of South America: Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, right? Now, Brazilian diplomacy seems to be involved in dealing with what they like to call variable geometry of multiple international coalitions. And 2 Brazilian political scientists, Amancio Jorge de Oliveira and Janina Onuki, they're both at the University of Sao Paulo, USP, they have devised an interesting matrix to disentangle the variable geometry of Brazilian diplomacy, which I'm very quickly presenting to you here. So they basically take these 3 groupings, Mercosur, IPSA, BRICS, they put them on interdependence, symbolic and normative significance, and asset for global governance. This is a Brazilian perspective. So for Brazil, BRICS is viewed as the best asset at the global level. Mercosur is no longer seen to be providing global leverage. Mercosur has become strictly for regional integration, right? And IPSA has largely symbolic and normative value. IPSA is important for Brazil and South Africa, in fact, more than India in some ways. Why? because both Brazil and South Africa have been in painful domestic political journeys to democracy. So they actually find a deep resonance with the democracy idea. They don't want to throw out IPSA because they like the idea of India, Brazil, and South Africa coming together, three democratic countries. Because democracies can discuss some things that autocracies cannot discuss. Local government, for example. You can learn lessons on local government from each other. What powers do your municipalities have? This is the power that our panchayats have, so on and so forth. But in a way, therefore, for Brazil, what is the thing? BRICS is what gives Brazil that international, that global projection. China's invitation to South Africa, as I've already mentioned, to join the BRICS summit at Sanya in 2011 was an initiative that was welcomed by the other three countries. Now that to me is an indication of the moral heft, the moral weight of South Africa in contemporary international politics. You cannot say include South Africa and somebody says, no, we don't want South Africa. It's just simply not possible. No country can do that. Its own publics will start asking questions about it, right? And of course, being singled out among all the African countries to be a part of the BRICS, it bolstered South Africa's self-perception as an active global citizen and a leader in Africa. It also strengthens South Africa's claim to a permanent role in global governance. So in the context of UN Security Council reform, etc., South Africa strengthens its position there. But also, let's accept South Africa's presence in the BRICS has also had a positive impact on the development cooperation dimension of the grouping. By South Africa coming in, the BRICS have been forced to look at issues relating to development cooperation. And in fact, even something like the New Development Bank, to some extent, is there because South Africa is there. And South Africa is constantly projecting the needs of all of Africa in the BRICS. So finally, why is India in the BRICS? And this is my understanding of it. Maybe or maybe not the understanding of the government of India, but this is my understanding as an analyst. India is in the BRICS because it cannot afford to be out of the grouping. It's as simple as that, right? And ideological and pragmatic strands have coexisted in Indian foreign policy from the very beginning. There's an ideological opposition to hierarchy, but that has gone together with a pragmatic willingness to achieve the best possible position for India within the system. So, of all the BRICS countries, India is easily the most positively inclined towards the US. Let's also understand that. However, India's domestic politics remain resolutely divided on the issue of India-US relations. So India's relation to the US is not something where there's a massive domestic consensus within India. It's a deeply divisive issue in the context of India's internal politics, right? And being a part of the BRICS moderates and levels out any supposed proximity that New Delhi may have with Washington, which is good for domestic politics. So that's one of the very important reasons why India is not only in the BRICS, but also in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's a counterweight to any kind of potential closeness that India is having towards the United States. Membership of the BRICS also rekindles old ties with Russia and builds a much needed bridge to China. You would not have annual India-Russia summits normally, right? But because both are a part of BRICS, the leaderships of Russia and India meet every year. So that's the advantage of being part of a grouping, that your top leadership, routine diplomatic activity keeps happening, right? But your top leadership meeting each other regularly on an annual basis creates continuity, creates all sorts of possibilities. And as I already said, although New Delhi has a marked preference for IPSA, BRICS became an alternate forum for both routine and high-level interaction with Brasilia and Pretoria. Now, one important point here before I move on to my next theme. The 5 BRICS countries, and I'm still talking about the original BRICS, are contra-hegemonic and revisionist to different degrees. So you could say all 5 of them are sort of in a way against hegemony. All 5 of them are revisionist. They want to change the structures of the system that currently exists, but to different degrees. And in the case of India, I suspect that the difference may be of kind, not of degree. And what do I mean by that? That India's sort of anti-hegemony kind of position may actually be qualitatively different from that of the others. And let us look at it this way. The faster the pace at which the relative power of the US declines, the better it would be from the respective perspectives of China, Russia, Brazil, and perhaps South Africa. So, the sooner the relative decline of the US takes place, the better it is going to be for Russia, the better it is going to be for China, and the better it is going to be for Brazil, for sure, maybe even South Africa. But the same cannot be said with confidence about India. Why? Because India would be unwilling to swap US global hegemony for Chinese continental hegemony. So India just actually is a bit of the odd country out, even in the context of the BRICS, on this very important question. Okay, friends, then, what are some of the challenges facing these original 5 BRICS countries? I see 6 transformation challenges, and I'm just laying them out like everything else I'm doing right now in a very telegraphic manner. The first of them is a demographic transition challenge. Russia is aging and declining in demographic terms, I mean. China is entering a demographic transition, namely, China is now aging as a society. India, on the other hand, has a young and growing population. So demographically, the story is actually very different in the context of these 3 large countries that are members of BRICS. Then secondly, we have what we may consider to be territorial consolidation challenges. And here, Brazil and Russia, as was already brought out to us in the first lecture today by Professor Nikulin, Brazil and Russia share similar challenges of sparsely populated territories of continental dimensions. His quip to us about Amazonia being, a hot Siberia, Siberia being a cold Amazonia is exactly this point, that both of them, these 2 states, have this really big challenge, which is that they have very sparsely populated territories. If it is true that there are already 10 million Mandarin speakers in Siberia, it is, at the moment, there may be a lot of bonhomie at state-to-state level between China and Russia. But this is bound to emerge as a major problem for Russia in terms of Russia's sovereignty, territorial integrity, so on and so forth. And that is what happens as a simple fact about Siberia being so sparsely populated and China being so densely populated, and therefore populations moving upwards, right? So I mean, these are some of the things that sort of we need to think about. Territorial consolidation, the challenge for Brazil and Russia is in fact surprisingly similar. Then, of course, we have mass poverty challenges. Brazil, China, and India all share this challenge, albeit to different degrees. That there are still areas of mass poverty in all 3 of these countries: the Brazilian Northeast, certain Indian states that I will not mention, and certainly many of the interior provinces of China. Fourth are what we may call economic distribution challenges. Brazil and South Africa are among the most unequal countries on the planet. I mean, the top 10% versus the bottom 10% in terms of incomes, the differences are just huge. 52 times, the top 10% are 52 times richer than the bottom 10%. And we're talking about 10%. If you go to the 1%, I mean, it's like, it's not even worth talking about. And also there are significant regional distribution challenges for all of the 5 BRICS countries. So if you see the distribution problem, not just in terms of socio-economic strata, but in geographical terms, then this is a problem for all 5 of the countries. And we also have cultural transformation challenges, which I think are being felt most severely in contemporary India. The whole fundamental question of who are we is a fundamental question that now, India is confronting in a very real sense, but it's also being experienced in South Africa. And finally, there is the challenges relating to democratic transition, consolidation, democracy maintenance, so on and so forth. So if I had to summarize all of that, and I've tried to summarize them in a single sentence each, this is what I would say, my friends. So, for each of these, for Brazil, what is its challenge in one sentence? It is developing a continent while maintaining ecological sustainability and reducing societal regional disparities. What is the key challenge for Russia? It is reviving a former great power by rejuvenating an aging society and arresting demographic decline. What is the key challenge for India? Modernizing an ancient society and filling the equity and infrastructure deficits of an emerging power. What is the key a single sentence challenge for China. It is balancing economic expectations, liberal aspirations, and nationalist sentiments in a rising power. And for South Africa, I would suggest it is reconciling equity demands of mass politics with the needs of elite sectors and economic dynamism. I'm moving to the fourth of the 5 things I'll be talking to you about, which is a surprisingly persistent trajectory. And so it starts off in 2009, Ekaterinburg, to 2010, Brasilia. This is what's surprising. Surprising thing is it's lasted. Every year they meet, Sanya, in 2011, Delhi 2012, Durban, South Africa 2013. And by the way, look at the logo of South Africa. You'll see the South Africans were the first to realize that if this is becoming routine, you don't need to have a new logo every time. The next country to understand that lesson was China. I think the other 3, Russia, Brazil, and India, are still learning that lesson, but they will. Then you had 2014 Fortaleza in Brazil. Then you had Ufa in Russia in 15, Goa in India in 16, but already the name of the place is disappearing. You're now just talking about India, right? 2017 China, they also don't bother to name the place. However, South Africa in 2018 still says it's in Johannesburg, right? And then everybody forgets about the place. We know where it was held, of course, but the logo is no longer saying that. 2019 Brazil, 2020 Russia, 2021 India. India is also now deciding to have a common logo. 2022 China, 2023 South Africa. And then we come to this monumental 2024 Russia, where 5 new countries become basically members of the BRICS. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, and Iran, right? So that's where we are right now, waiting for the next summit, which will take place in Brazil later this year in July. Now, why this persistent trajectory? You could ask. I've just showed you all the ways in which these countries face different challenges, this, that, and the other. And the answer for that is this, my friends. In the last 2 decades, global governance has risen from obscurity to become a seminal idea in international relations. Global governance is about how power operates in an interdependent environment in the absence of government. You don't have a government at the international level. There is no government over the governments of the world. And therefore, you have to have interdependence in a world that is interdependent but without government. I have written about this. I call them the 10 P's of global governance. I've just put it up very simply as this chart. You've got problems of participation, presence, and permanence. The question there is who decides and who is excluded. Then you have the question of posts, who implements programs and executes decisions. For instance, posts, why is it that the president of the World Bank is always an American? Why is it, that the Director General of, the IMF is always a European? What's the deal there? Problems, what gets priority when, postures, positions, policies, programs, and finally power, which is how a matter is decided and implemented. Believe me, I've written about this. I can go on to this at great length. I'm not going to. But you get the picture that these are the key challenges of global governance. There's a growing sense that transformation of the structures of global governance is desperately and urgently needed. And that is where the BRICS do become extremely relevant as the only countries that can convincingly challenge the status quo. So the name of the game, therefore, for the BRICS is this. The structures of global governance are not going to change unless they are challenged. And you cannot challenge them individually, not even China. And that's why these countries need to meet every year. They need to work together. I get to the last and final part of what I'll be talking to you about this afternoon, which is an incoherent but necessary expansion. You look at those 5 countries that joined in 2024. Don't mind my saying so as an analyst. It's a bit of a strange list. You've got, first there was only one African country earlier in the BRICS. Now you have Egypt and Ethiopia as well, right? You have Iran and the United Arab Emirates. So, of the 5 countries that have now come in, 4 are predominantly Islamic, right? Only Ethiopia is not. But one of the problems of the BRICS was precisely that there was no Islamic country that was a part of the BRICS. But if you think about an Islamic country, I would have thought the obvious Islamic country was Indonesia. And if not Indonesia, perhaps Turkey. Indonesia is now coming in. So, there's been kind of this kind of incoherence to this expansion. But I still argue that it is a necessary expansion. And that is the point on which I'm going to end my presentation. So, this was the picture in 2014 of the 10 largest economies in nominal terms, nominal GDP, US trillion dollars, USA, China, Japan, Germany, UK, France, Brazil, India, Italy, India, and Russia. This was the story in 2014. By 2018, the story had already changed, become USA, China, Japan, Germany, Brazil, France, Russia, UK, India, Italy. And these are obviously just projections for 2050, where you have China, USA, India, Indonesia, Japan, Germany, Brazil, UK, Mexico, and France. So what do these projections up to 2050 suggest? That power would have substantially shifted from the Euro-Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. China would be the largest player in the game. Both China and India would be larger than the other top 10 countries combined, minus the US. The West would not have withered away. Let's keep this in mind. The US will remain the second largest player. UK, France, and Germany would be significant. Africa would continue to remain absent from global power, which is a really sobering thing to think about. 25 years down the track, there'll still be no African country which will be that big to have actually got into the top 10 in terms of its economy. Brazil and Mexico would have emerged as very serious contenders as well. Now, here's a key question: where's Russia? And the problem is, in the case of Russia, is the same problem that Japan is going to face, which is demographic decline. In fact, Russia and Japan together are 2 examples of countries that score very high on knowledge generation, very high on human capital, but because of their declining demographics, both of them are going to find themselves basically running out of working age populations. In both cases, you would need some kind of a technological revolution to keep them still in the top 10. Japan is doing it. Japan is completely automating everything, right? Aware of what its population dynamics are. That's going to be one of the key questions about whether Russia in the 2050 time frame is going to be in the top 10 economically. That's going to be the key question. It's not that technology will still emerge from Russia, but will it be that kind of a technological revolution that we are seeing in Japan? That, to me, and I say this with great humility, I'm in a room filled with Russia specialists and an eminent scholar from Russia. I'm not at all a specialist on Russia, but humbly I would say this is in some ways really the key question as far as Russia itself is concerned. What do these projections miss? Well, they miss the following: the impact of disruptive technologies. That's what I mean. If there's a technological revolution, all of this could change. If tomorrow there's a technological revolution emerging out of Africa, and by the way, in biotechnology, Africa is doing fantastically. We'll go to African universities, they're exciting places to be. The younger generation of Africa are really, really exciting. They're doing really interesting stuff. But, that is one of the key questions. Disruptive technologies, the impact of global climate change. For example, the opening up of the resources of the tundra and navigation in Arctic waters. This could be the game changer for Russia. That all of these territories, which basically have been under permafrost since the last ice age, as a result of global warming, as they open up, they could be some of the most fertile lands in the world, right? Simply because they've not been cultivated for generations, right? And so, that may be a source of real economic dynamism in the future for Russia, as the resources of Siberia become easily accessible, as the Arctic slowly melts, and the Arctic becomes navigable for 6 months or 8 months of the year. That could be a source of wealth for Russia. So there are plenty of things that could happen. And these projections are not taking account of some of these changes. And finally, the impact of new networks of finance, production, and exchange. For example, a new global reserve currency, a new lender of the last resort, cryptocurrency. Any of these things, if they come in a big way, could be massive game changers, and these projections up to 2050 may be deemed to be nonsensical. I'm almost done, sir. I know you're looking very impatient. I'm almost done. I promise. I mean, I think I'm done in about 2 slides. Okay. So what am I saying here, my friends? I'm saying basically this: the power of the BRICS will depend upon 5 interlocking factors. Their economic growth rates, obviously. If any of them, their growth rates decline, forget the game. The game is over. I mean, they're no longer really contending. That's one of the key things that China has taught us. That when a continent-sized country begins to grow, everything changes. When a small country grows economically like Singapore, Singapore changes, right? Nothing else does. But when a continent-sized country begins to grow at those rates, everything changes. Everything. You know, and that's the point. So economic growth rates, first of all, the ingenuity and vitality of their societies. That's why don't say goodbye yet to American power. It remains the only country in the world that is able to take talented people from everywhere, bring them into their country, integrate them into their country, and make them Americans. The current president of the United States may change all of that. But so far, that has been the American story for a century and a half, right? That may change. I mean, none of these things are carved in stone, right? But this is a key question. The relative power of the regional rivals and extra-regional competitors. Here again, Trump's America is actually a very good example. One of the reasons for American power is its sea power, its navy. The only country that deploys an active fighting naval force on every ocean, sea, and waterway in the world, right? But how does the United States do that? It does that because it has had peaceful northern and southern borders. So, in geostrategic terms, the United States was an island, like Japan, like the United Kingdom. It didn't face a threat on land because both its northern border and its southern border were
Protected.
were peaceful. So you didn't have to devote any resources to protecting your land, your national territory. On land, you could go and spend that on your navy and build this multi-oceanic navy. And again, the current president of the United States, I like not to say his name if I can avoid it, is changing that by militarizing both the northern and southern borders of the country, unnecessarily, by the way. And you know, that I suspect is going to have a long-term impact on the United States, to the detriment of the United States, and therefore to the advantage of the BRICS and all other states that have an interest in relative decline of the United States. By the way, 30 seconds, Professor Pandey will allow me. Please remember, when we talk about decline in international relations, we're always talking about relative decline, never about absolute decline. Okay? You know, the Britain today of Keir Starmer is infinitely more wealthy and powerful than the Britain of Queen Victoria. The standard of life of an average British citizen today is infinitely better than that. But that's not the point. Britain at that time of Queen Victoria, was the systemic hegemon. Today, Britain is a great power in decline. It's first rung beginning to sort of move into second rung as some of these other states rise. Again, not because Britain is necessarily doing anything bad, it's just that others are rising faster. So the whole game about international politics, please remember, it's always a relative game. So you can feel very happy about yourself. Oh, look how well I'm doing. But if you say that, you're really only comparing yourself with your past. And that's great if you're thinking only domestically, if you're thinking in developmental terms. But if you're thinking in international political terms, that's not the point. It's not you comparing yourself vis-a-vis your past. It's you comparing yourself vis-a-vis everybody else today. And that's a fundamental difference between the way you do a calculus in domestic politics and in international politics. The ability to project their prominence in ways that others perceive as benign and attractive. So it's not just power projection per se, but to be seen as being benign and attractive. So when China does the Belt and Road Initiative, and it begins to be resented in the countries where they're making these massive investments, that's a big negative for China. When China goes into Africa in a big way and there begins to be resentment growing in Africa about China's presence, that's a big negative. So it's not just projecting your prominence, but it's also doing it in a way that others feel that other states, other societies feel that they're benefiting from it. And also, of course, the point that I've already made, the speed at which the power of the systemic hegemon declines relative to their own increasing power. The point I had already made. The BRICS countries then will become a genuine revisionist force in global governance and world politics more broadly only if they are able to transform themselves from a conglomeration of states with varied interests into an organization that could strategically add new members whenever the need arises. This is probably one of the most important transparencies in my presentation this afternoon, my friends. That, I'm absolutely convinced about this. That, they are still, all said and done, a conglomeration of states. They have to change from that into being an organization, right? This cannot be another NAM, in other words, which is just based around summit diplomacy. That's not going to work out here. By creating, and this is my last slide, Professor Pandey. He's the chair, please. I'm saying it respectfully. No. By creating a permanent secretariat, the BRICS countries, which today in Portuguese, you would say os BRICS, the BRICS, but as a plural, right, could evolve into a single BRICS, u BRICS. I'm sorry I'm using Portuguese here, but in English you cannot make that distinction, right? Because that singular plural thing doesn't work out in English. So from us BRICS, we've got to basically become u BRICS. So the BRICS, you see them as one single entity. And I believe that the permanent secretariat should be located well south of the equator. I really feel that if you locate it in the northern hemisphere, it's going to become a part of Eurasian geopolitics. It needs to be somewhere in the southern hemisphere. If we really are serious about challenging global governance, we need to locate that out there. All of these things I'm saying are my views as an analyst. They are not the views of the government of India or of anybody else. I speak as an academic only for myself. And I feel that BRICS should be renamed as a cooperation organization, right? Either a Cape Town cooperation organization or a Rio de Janeiro cooperation organization. Find a nice, beautiful location somewhere out there in the southern hemisphere. They'll be so excited that they will, either Brazil or South Africa will give you prime land and you'll get a beautiful view. You can have a lovely secretariat, and some of you may end up, saying that forget the Foreign Service, I'm resigning from the Foreign Service to be permanently a member of the Secretariat of this cooperation organization. That, I think, is the future of the BRICS, if it is going to be successful in actually challenging the current existing structures of global governance. Thank you very much, sir. I'm done.
When I was talking in superlatives, you thought I'm taunting you or something. But the audience would tell you that no one could have done it better than you. The way you summarized the BRICS story and the various facets, only you could. One thing. We will invite questions, although very few. Just one point, since you said there are people who know something about Russia, how fundamentally BRICS should be a Russian story. It's because Primakov, you mentioned, when Primakov came out with his ideas on foreign policy, 3 points he emphasized. One was multipolarity, second was multilateralism, and third was the most important. He said, alternative line on various global and regional issues. The world was unipolar at that time. Only the US position or line on various issues was considered to be the line. He talked about alternative lines and then alternative position, and that is what is BRICS, trying to come out with alternative position. Another thing about Russia that you said was that fundamentally Russia is Western, which is partly true, but not entirely. One very important writer on Russian foreign policy said that Russian foreign policy may not always be pro-West, but the fact remains it is always West-centric. So Russia in that sense is very Western because West has been the constant point of reference for Russian politics, its foreign policy, its culture and civilization. So centrality of West, you very well underlined. Few questions only. Arey Baba, we can't take so many. And we never had such a full house on any of the other days. Yes, very quick, no longish monologues. Very, very few.
चलो जो कुछ नए स्टूडेंट हैं एटलीस्ट
First of all, thank you, Professor, for this wonderful lecture. My name is Shalini, and I am a PhD student at Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies. So my question is that can we say that Global South today navigates between multipolarity and neocolonialism, in the sense that when most of the countries of the Global South were colonized at one point of time, but when we see China's debt trap policy, can we say that it is using new strategies of neocolonialism in the sense? So can we say that Global South at one point of time it is a multipolar world order, and the same thing which it is challenging a unipolar world order, but at the same time it is using neocolonialism strategies? Thank you.
All right.
Take two or three.
Just one sentence.
माइक ही गायब हो गया.
Hi sir, thank you for your presentation. Sir, you have talked about India's ambiguity regarding swapping US hegemony.
नाम बता दो आप तो मैं लिख लूँगा.
Sir, my name is Prashant. I am PhD candidate at Center for South Asian Studies.
Thank you.
Sir, you have talked about India's ambiguity regarding swapping US hegemony with the Chinese hegemony. So with India signing the three foundational agreements, SESMOA, COMCASA and BECA, do you think that India has made up its mind?
तीन तीन लेते जाएं. नहीं आप बताइए.
Good evening, sir. My name is Sudhanshu Ranjan. I am from the CPS doing masters.
I didn't get your name. Sorry, what's your name?
Sir, Sudhanshu Ranjan
Okay, correct.
from CPS. Sir, you have mentioned about the different approach of the countries of the BRIC toward the West, or particularly the US. You talked about the kind of approach and the degree approach. Sir, how do you think it could be possible for India, and to how far to maintain its kind of approach, and will expansion of BRICS help India to sustain its approach? Thank you, sir.
ले लेते हैं.
Good evening, Professor. I am Nitish. I am from Russia and Central Asia Studies. I am PhD scholar there. Sir, if revisionist power are not happy with their existing norms of global order, why won't they challenge the system entirely? Doesn't the salami slicing diminishes the traditional deterrence and increases the chances of open warfare?
Just repeat.
China salami.
China.
आप आगे लेते आइए. अब नहीं, no more. चलिए.
Thank you, Professor, for this nice presentation from your side. I'm Nandini Ghosh, an PhD scholar at Center for Asian and Central Asian Studies. I have one question, and I would like to have your comment rather than an answer. That you have talked about that BRICS wants to challenge the geopolitical West, not the other parts of the West, maybe cultural or economic West. So India is part of it, China is part of it. As you have projected in your expectations, what BRICS is about and what it's going to do in next 25 years. So in that projection, you have very specifically mentioned about the roles of other countries and their aims and wishes from this organization, and you said in your presentation that India is in BRICS because it cannot afford to be out of BRICS. So can we think that is it a check on China's expectations out of BRICS? Is it a checks?
You have made a point. The last one, which was in fact the second hand, but yes.
Thank you, sir, for the enlightening session. And I have a question that what's your stance on global governance? Where is it going, heading towards? It started in the 1990 eras, Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the UK, government to governance. Now, where's it heading? As you said in the governance term, in your first lecture also, and this also. Yeah, I'm wrapping up. I had a lot of things to say, to ask the question. Wish I could be my professor. I'm from Delhi School of Economics.
You can just summarize.
Thanks. It's nice when somebody from D school asks questions. Okay, Shalini, this between multipolarity and post-colonialism. See, the thing about multipolarity is very simple. It's that, you know, when a hegemony breaks, you know, what is it replaced by? You know, there have been two previous cases, really, since we've had a territorial state system of hegemony breaking down. First was France. At the time, it was still a European state system, you know, France of Louis XIV. And when French hegemony breaks, it is replaced by a multipolar system, right? You have three contending powers that emerge, you know, England, Russia, and Habsburg Austria to basically challenge French power. The second time hegemony exists is during Victorian Britain, when it's truly a global hegemony. And when it breaks down, you again have three, it becomes a multipolar system. You have the United States, you have Japan, you know, emerging to challenge again. The interesting thing in this round of hegemony is we keep talking about multipolarity, but this may in fact be historically different, that hegemony will be replaced by bipolarity, which hasn't happened in the past two cases historically. You know, I'm still not fully convinced with arguments that it will naturally, necessarily be multipolar. And for that, I say that there's a category difference between China and countries like India and Brazil. I consider China to be a rising power and Brazil and India to be emerging powers. And this is not just a fancy play of English. Rising power is a state that has a systemic impact today. An emerging power is a state that is likely to have a systemic impact tomorrow, right? And so there is actually, to my mind, a category difference between China in the contemporary world and India and Brazil. So I'm not entirely convinced that it's going to be a multipolar order. On post-colonialism, I'll just ask a simple question to you in reverse. When did we become post-colonial?
I was talking about neo-colonial.
Oh, neo-colonial. I didn't hear that. Sorry. I heard post-coloniality. That's what I was trying. Well, neocolonialism means what? Neocolonialism means essentially that you continue to be economically extractive without any longer maintaining kind of political control over a territory. You don't need to maintain political control because you work with sort of local elites, and you know, you sort of, and they do your work for you. You don't need to actually be the government yourself. That is basically the neocolonial model. I mean, so you know, there are very serious scholars, you know, in Africa, etc., who are saying that a new type of neocolonialism is now arising in Africa. Sure, but I'm not sure I can really answer that question in terms of the global South. I think the global South is too varied, you know, and you know, it includes within its small island states and large industrializing economies. It includes within the major energy exporters. So I mean, I'm a bit hesitant to make global South kind of pronouncements because analytically it doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, the Indian ambiguity was asked by Prashant. The Indian approach was asked by Sudhanshu, and why is India in BRICS was asked by Nandini. I think the answers to all of them are basically the same. In an earlier period, immediately after independence, when India emerged in the international system as a sovereign territorial state, it took a decision that it was not going to be a part of either power bloc in that bipolar system, that it was going to, in effect, sit the fence. And from that arises what we all know as non-alignment. In international relations theory, non-alignment would be what we call a hiding strategy. You're basically hiding from the power politics. You're staying out of it. You're keeping the head below the parapets, right? But here's the thing about a hiding strategy. Only weak states can hide. And India, at the time of independence, was a large, weak post-colonial state. So was China, by the way. After the People's Revolution in China, China was also a large, weak post-colonial state. You know, but you cannot hide if you are strong. And today, whatever else India is not a weak state. It's a strong state. So you need to have a different strategy. And that strategy is not called hiding, it's called transcending. You somehow have to rise above power politics and try to find ways in which to mediate it, right? I've written about this. If you Google my name and current history, for example, I have a piece in current history. So some of this is pretty much prehistoric writings of mine, but I've been writing about this for a long time. In summary, you can create a cooperative security mechanism in the Asia Pacific, such as what used to exist, and probably some would argue still exists in the Euro-Atlantic, which is the OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, the outcome of the Helsinki process. We have no equivalent of that in the Indo-Pacific region, right? So that is something on which India can work. Will the Indian approach, look, again, I'm speaking very telegraphically here, so forgive me for that, but see, one way to understand non-alignment is to understand that it was the foreign policy cognate of the mixed economy domestically. And India adopted a mixed economy. In other words, it said, yes, we will have centralized state planning. We will have the state as an economic actor, but we will also allow capitalism to exist. We will also allow the private sector to exist. We will also allow private initiative to exist, right? And non-alignment is in some ways a cognate of that. And the reason for that, the wisdom of it now in hindsight we can see, was that otherwise the public life of this country would have been ruptured intolerably on that question. And that rupture didn't happen. Everybody could be comfortable in this country, from the right to the left, because there was it was accommodative domestically, it was accommodative internationally. Now, is that going to change? Is India going to become an ally of the United States? I can answer it in a single word: no. India is far too large to be a part of any other country's security community. It's not going to happen. The Americans think it's going to happen. They hope it's going to happen, but it's not going to happen. And if that is the expectation, sooner or later, India-US relations will hit a massive landmine. It's not going to happen. It simply cannot. India, and don't forget, the security community of the Western democracies. And when I say security community of the Western democracies, what do I mean? I mean the Atlantic Alliance, plus Israel, plus Japan, plus South Korea, plus Australia, plus New Zealand, full stop. There's no other country. That's the security community of the Western market democracies. India has never been a part of it. And in a very significant sense, threats to India have never been seen by them as threats to democracy. Whenever India has been under threat, it has been a threat to India. It's never been a threat to democracy. When a terrorist bomb explodes in London or in Madrid, it's a threat to democracy. When a terrorist act takes place in Mumbai, that's India's problem. So I'm very clear about this. It's not going to happen. It's simply not on the cards. And there are many, many, many reasons for that. I'm again speaking very quickly here to sort of do it. What do you want me to say about China's salami slicing tactics? I'm not sure I can say very much other than to say that, look, to my mind, until India has a credible nuclear deterrent against Chinese misbehavior on the line of actual control will continue. So until we have the Agni 5s in serial production and squadron service, Agni 5s would give us coverage over all of China's national territory. Until we have the Agni 5s in serial production and squadron service, China is going to continue to misbehave. The day we have these as a part of our fighting forces, regularly inducted, regular units, everything will change. And a deterrence relationship and a mutual security understanding will emerge between China and India, much as it did between the Soviet Union and the United States. Right? India's situation is more complicated than that of the Soviet Union and the United States for two reasons. One, we have Pakistan as another factor. The US and the Soviet Union are only signaling to each other. We have to signal to Beijing and Islamabad at the same time, which is very complicated. And in nuclear deterrence, signaling is very important. Signaling to the adversary is very critical. That's one. And the other was geographically, if you forget the Bering Straits, the Soviet Union and the United States were actually very far geographically from each other. whereas China and India are not. So the launch times and the reaction times and all of that is much shorter. So, I know you probably wanted me to analyze the line of actual control and the border, but for me, from my vantage point as an analyst, that is the key game out there. When that happens, all of this stuff will, to my mind, come to an end.
By the way, just one point. Very deliberately, I didn't mention that Professor Varun Sahani has been the 10th Vice Chancellor of Jammu University and 8th Vice Chancellor of Goa University, because I feel these are inconsequential. He would not be known as former Vice Chancellor, but much more as a very fine scholar and an eloquent speaker.
Thank you.